Great pleasure to introduce Dr Stuart Allan as this evening's speaker. Stuart is Keeper of Scottish History and Archaeology at the National Museum Scotland and Head of Department of over 25 specialist curators whose expertise covers the material culture of Scotland from about 13,000 BC to the present day. Stuart has delivered several successful exhibitions at the National Museum of Scotland, including Common Cause, Commonwealth Scots and the Great War, 2014, and Admiral Cochrane, the Real Master and Commander. And he's also given exhibitions at the National War Museum in Edinburgh Castle, where he began his museum career. He's the author of a number of research publications, including Commando Country, a study of the Second World War special training centres in the Scottish Highlands. In 2017, he was joint recipient of a major research grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council for the project Baggage and Belonging, Military Collecting and the British Empire 1750 to 1900, which is a UK-wide interdisciplinary study of the culture of collecting by soldiers in the context of colonial warfare. His collaborative research has also received funding support from the Royal Society of Edinburgh and from the British Academy. Stuart has been with the National Museums of Scotland since 2000, previously as Principal Curator of Modern and Contemporary History, and before that as Senior Curator of Military History. His earlier career included positions at Aberdeen Art Gallery and Museums, the Gordon Highlanders Museum, Aberdeen, and the National Records of Scotland. He's a member of the Joint Advisory Committee of the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Collection Trust and the Abbotsford Trust, and an honorary advisor, military collections for the National Trust of Scotland. Stuart's title features David Stewart of Garth, the Scots Highlander of the old stamp, which I believe is a quotation from a letter of Scots to J.G. Lockhart of the 14th of July 1828. The name rings a particularly sharp bell for me personally, since later that year Stuart, on the point of taking up a governorship in the West Indies, wrote to Scott requesting that, as several ladies among his friends were anxious to have Scott's autograph, he, Scott, would therefore, I quote, favour me with a few lines and scribble your signature as often as the paper will hold. The resulting verses, which survive in a letter of Scott's now held in a library in Switzerland, and which repeat Scott's full name in alternating lines, was sensibly not cut up to satisfy autograph hunters, and the following text will appear in the forthcoming edition of Scott's shorter poems that I'm editing with Gillian Hughes. And this is it. Brave Stuart, name without a blot, yours to command is Walter Scott. Whate'er in Waverley is rot, I bear the blame, quoth Walter Scott. An old grey man sore failed I wot, there's life in't yet, said Walter Scott. Trees did he plant and lands he bought, a Darnick laird was Walter Scott. He loved a man that bravely fought, and Garth was friend to Walter Scott. With Highland chiefs he had a vote, for well the plaids loved Walter Scott. The greyhounds good were fleet as thought, till aged lamed them and Walter Scott. Call this vile stuff, I reck it not, so there's an end of Walter Scott. Dr. Allan's own approach will reflect his long-standing interest in the relationship between military service and the adoption of Highland traditions as symbolic of Scotland in the late 18th and early 19th century. He's currently leading a team working on a forthcoming major exhibition embracing this theme, which he'll be introducing to you through his talk this evening. Dr. Allan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, and to Lee for setting me up, and also to Madeline Mackenzie, who I think collared me for this occasion about a year ago. I'm very grateful to the Society for the invitation to speak to you this evening, and in particular on the subject of Major General David Stewart of Garth, who, as I expect will become apparent, is a figure whose influence in the history of and culture of Scotland I especially admire. I would expect many of you will have come across David Stewart through his friendship with Sir Walter Scott and his key contribution to the pageantry orchestrated by Scott for the royal visit of George IV to Edinburgh in 1822, possibly through his authorship of the celebrated multi-volume history Sketches of the Highlanders, which was a successful and controversial work of Highland history, which Stewart published also in 1822. My own introduction to David Stewart was through the collection of artefacts relating to his career, which form part of the military collections of National Museum Scotland. These particular things being displayed at present in the Highland Soldier Gallery at the National War Museum in Edinburgh Castle, and some of which you can see on the slide. So I have some pictures for you this evening. I'm doing this from notes. I used to pride myself on doing this kind of thing without notes, but in recent years I've found that more and more difficult. So concluding that I'm past my prime, I'll try not to read to you. I also noticed that every time I do this, I was saying to Peter just now, the font of the notes seem to get larger and larger. So, Highland Laird, career soldier, historian, antiquarian, colonial governor. Stuart's story is an extraordinary one, but it's not my intention simply to talk you through the story of his life. For that, if you are interested, the place I would refer you to is this biography called The First Highlander by James Irvin Robertson, which is 20 years old now, but is still available in Kindle edition, and that can obviously give you the story in much greater depth than anything I can attempt this evening. As you've heard, I have an ulterior motive, I usually do, which is to present some episodes and objects from David Stewart's life in order to introduce some of the themes that will be featuring in a forthcoming exhibition at the National Museum of Scotland, which explores aspects of the relationship between Romanticism, European Romanticism, and Scotland. The exhibition traces the emergence of that version of Scotland that we all know, of Highland landscapes, of tartan, of clans, of the great Highland bagpipe, that remain with us today as still the first thing that the world at large knows about Scotland. In talking about this, this is between us, please, because I had thought by this time that we would announce details of the exhibition, and in fact, for very uninteresting reasons, we haven't done so yet publicly. So we have a very skilled team of marketing and communication people. One or two of them are quite fierce. So if any of this gets out into the press, I will be skewered and roasted alive. So please, for the time being, this stays amongst us. So as I imagine we all, as we all know, before the second half of the 18th century, the cultural traditions of the Scottish Highlands were little understood in the rest of the country and beyond, and were often regarded by other Scots as alien and backward. The 1745 Jacobite rebellion reinforced that sense of disdain and hostility, temporarily at least. The exhibition will explore how, in the era of the European Romantic movement, and through deliberate promotion by influential Highlanders, which is significant, how the Scottish Highlands became the subject of international fascination amazingly quickly after that. So the shorthand of the period, I suppose, is from Culloden to Balmoral, and Highland traditions becoming established as enduring symbols of Scottish identity. We are, of course, entering into contested territory. The romantic tartan-clad ideal of Scotland was controversial from the start. Right through to the present day, doubts have been expressed and have remained about an image that has been seen as a stereotype at best, or at worst, as a fantasy with little grounding in the real life of Scotland, past and present. One, moreover, which took hold in the era of the Highland clearances, as we've come to call them, and against the backdrop of a crisis in Gaelic society, language and culture. Now, this is a well-covered subject in relation to fine art and literature, But being a museum, we're interested, of course, in material evidence, in things. There will be paintings and literature aplenty, but using material artifacts above all, we will seek to trace the origins and development of the dress, design, music, which made up the Highland image that the world recognises today. And what I want to see us do is question the sceptical view that the Romantic version of the Highlands was purely invention. We will seek to present a more balanced interpretation, showing how cultural traditions were preserved, idealised certainly, and reshaped to suit contemporary tastes against a backdrop of political agendas, but preserved, not invented. David Stewart was in the middle of all this, as of course was Walter Scott. This 1832 portrait by James Scrimgeour hangs in the Black Watch Museum in Perth, which if you haven't been to, I would recommend strongly. All the regimental museums in Scotland have something to teach us about the cultural history of Scotland beyond the niche of military history. I would argue, of all of them, probably the Black Watch the most. On first acquaintance, we might be forgiven for seeing no more here than a typical military portrait of an officer from a Highland regiment, which indeed is what Stewart was. Military decorations on his chest, his I was in Iceland last week and I've come back with an Icelandic cold. Military decorations on his chest, Highland dress uniform, officer's broadsword. But if we look again more closely, we can see quite quickly that this is not, in fact, a military portrait. First of all, he's not actually wearing military uniform. His jacket is not the red coat of the regimental dress. His kilt and plaid are not in the regimental tartan, but are in fact of his own Stuart family tartan. The sword I will say more about presently. So this is Stuart representing himself to us as a Highlander, with his ancestral home of Garth Castle in ruins in the background. In some respects, his career as a historian was about defining, for better or for worse, what Highlander meant. The definition of an ideal of the Highlander that, as we say, has stayed with us. As a shorthand for this, I think of it as Highlander with a capital H. So first thing, by any definition, Stuart really was a Highlander. In the invention of tradition argument, aimed at Sir Walter Scott and his contemporaries by historians, principally Hugh Trevor Roper back in 1983, when the invention of tradition came out, normally referred to as Highlandism these days. The suggestion is that the traditions of Gaelic society were appropriated and distorted into a bogus version of Scotland by romantic enthusiasts who were unrepresentative of authentic Highland society, and who indeed had connived at its destruction. So quoting Trevor Roper, the whole concept of a distinct Highland culture and tradition is a retrospective invention. Now let me say at the outset, and as we shall see, Stuart was undoubtedly one of those who very deliberately set out to codify and promote a particular version of the Highland past as an expression of what it might mean to be Scottish. But he was no imposter, no interloper. Stuart was born in 1772 as the younger son into a family of minor lairds in Highland Perthshire in the vicinity of Fortingall. And if you go there today, you will find at the roadside near Keltneyburn this statue, placed there by the Stewart Society in 1925. The inscription concludes with the maxim in Gaelic, which I will not even presume to attempt. In translation, remember the men from whom you have come. Stuart was himself a native Gaelic speaker, bilingual, fully steeped in the Gaelic traditions of that part of the country, of lairds who still lived their lives as patriarchs among their tenantry and shared their culture while simultaneously moving in the wider currents of British society in the professions, the church, the army. The family estates of Garth and Drumcherry were inherited by Stuart in the 1820s. Incidentally, the burden of debt upon them meant that, as with his friend Walter Scott, money was always an issue, and particularly so in later life. As a third son of Highland gentry, Stuart's path into the British Army was a well-trodden one. The recruiting of Highland regiments through the influence of local aristocrats and lairds had become firmly established as a career outlet for young men, whether of the officer classes or filling the ranks for Britain's wars against France. First glorified, since sometimes dismissed as a ruthless emptying of the Highlands for the purposes of imperial expansion, historians such as my chum Andrew McKillop and Matthew Jennick have demonstrated that the realities of Highland recruitment were complex and could work to the advantage of the Highland tenantry as a source of revenue, keeping them on the land. David Stewart obtained a commission in the 77th Highlanders as an ensign, that's the most junior officer, that would be like a second lieutenant today, in 1783, aged 11, which was young, but not remarkably young at that time, for a young man as would have been seen entering into military life. He remained a soldier for the rest of his life, although, like many of his fellows, quite often on half pay, which is a sort of form of unemployment. When you weren't needed as a regular officer, you were put on the half pay system and had to wait for a vacancy to come along. He served mostly with the Black Watch and ultimately rose to the rank of Major General. I won't dwell overly on his distinguished military career, other than to say that the prevalence of military service and the success of the Highland regiments will permeate the exhibition. Since his British fortunes in land warfare changed during the Napoleonic Wars, the distinctive figure of the Highland soldier became recognised internationally as an icon of British heroism. Mass recruitment of Highland regiments began during the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, but I would argue that the idea of the noble Highland soldier first came fully into public view with the popular response to the British victory against Napoleon's Egyptian expedition at Alexandria in 1801, and David Stewart was there. He received his first battlefield wound at Alexandria, and so was a recipient of the medal struck by the Royal Society of London to celebrate the heroism of the Highland regiments. The relationship between Highland regiments and the Scottish nationality of the British commander Sir Ralph Abercrombie, who died on the battlefield, gave a particularly Scottish dimension to what at that point was a rare British victory on land. And this was reflected in the production of prints and souvenirs on the London market, as in this image of a Black Watch officer. That's a artistically placed Black Watch officer's spotter sitting on top of it. The medal was designed by Benjamin West, by the way, based on sketches prepared by the Scottish miniaturist Andrew Robertson. The Gaelic inscription, which translates as "These are the heroes of Egypt." I put this in because the Highland Society of London is essential in this story as the prototype for the many Highland societies in Scotland and overseas that followed. This was an association of Highland aristocrats, gentlemen and military officers resident or temporarily resident in London, formed in 1778. Hugely influential in the popularising of the romantic vision of the Scottish Highlands, cultivating royal patronage, lobbying successfully for the repeal of the ban on Highland dress, instigated after Culloden, which they achieved in 1782, championing the economic progress of the Highlands as they saw it, providing charitable relief for Highlanders, promoting bagpiping, bolstering the Gaelic language, and celebrating the battlefield success of the Highland regiments. Stewart was a military recruiter himself, raising men for a 2nd Battalion of the 78th Highlanders, and it was with these fresh troops of the 78th that he had his finest hour on the battlefield at the Battle of Maida in the toe of Italy in 1806. And you might know the name Maida, of course, because it was Walter Scott's dog, though that was not through Stewart, as it turns out. Napoleon's France had invaded Italy, deposed the King of Naples, and Maida was part of a British expedition in support of the Neapolitan rebels, though there was an underlying strategic objective of preventing a French occupation of Sicily. Major Stewart, with his commanding officer wounded and hors de combat, turned confusion and growing panic in his untried regiment back into order and the delivery of disciplined, steady musket fire, receiving a 2nd battlefield wound in the process. Now, given that his action there was about turning a confused retreat into a disciplined advance, Stuart's own account of his part in the action was always somewhat circumspect. And I quote, "In this action I had the opportunity of performing an important piece of service. Personal attachments and regard for the memory of officers whose character might suffer by stating the particular circumstances of this affair prevent me from doing so. I've had the same feeling from the day of the battle, and I have not only avoided writing on the subject, but even speaking of it, except to those who were present and knew the whole. By a prompt and decided interference, I checked a retrograde movement, more properly a retreat of my regiment in the very heat and most important moment of the battle." Just popping back to him. In his portraits, Stuart, not a big man, bespectacled, looking his age there, arguably looks more like the writer than the fighter. But his physical courage was often manifest. And in this particular circumstance, his biographer records a family tradition, unverified, I should say, that imposing himself to retrieve the situation at Maida meant that he actually shot one of his own panicking officers. For his gallantry at Maida, Stuart was decorated, made a Companion of the Bath, and awarded the Maida Gold Medal. He received a silver punch bowl from the Lloyd's Patriotic Fund, silver salver from the London Patriotic Society. All of these things can now be seen in the museum along with his decorations. When he left the museum 2 years later, when he left the battalion 2 years later, he received the very fine silver basket-hilted broadsword, which he's holding in this Grimshaw portrait, and which we can see here, in black and white, as a tribute from his fellow regimental officers. This seems to me to rather cast doubt on the story that he had shot one of their number, although in doing so, I suppose he may have saved the reputations of the remainder with according gratitude being expressed. The sword, whatever the origin, is something rather special. It is rare at this period to see a Highland basket-hilted sword with a hilt made in assayed silver. It's by Joshua Johnson of London, 1808. It's modelled on mid-18th century sword hilts, which would usually be wrought iron, and these were already prized as ideas of the antique in the first decade of the 19th century. The double-edged steel blade bears an inscription, now hard to read, from his brother officers as a testimony of their high regard for him as an officer, companion and friend. This sword will feature in the exhibition, most especially the sword, because it was this sword that Stuart wore throughout the 1822 royal visit to Edinburgh. So moving away from the military stuff, Stuart's first antiquarian venture proceeded from his membership of the Royal Society of London, which he joined in 1814 to the end of the war against Napoleonic France, first abdication of Napoleon, which meant a period of half pay for Stuart and his friends. In 1815, Stuart took up a suggestion from society colleagues, again it was the miniaturist Andrew Robertson, to use his time to preserve a record of the tartans of the Highland clans. So returning to his home in Highland pasture, Stuart wrote to aristocrats, chiefs and heads of families, asking them to send a sample of their clan or district tartan. And the result was this ledger of samples, still in the ownership of the Highland Society of London today, but displayed in the National Museum of Scotland. It contains the original samples sent to Stuart along with the seals of the chiefs consulted. It's been monkeyed around with, unfortunately, but because a second version was made, but you still get the sense of what he was doing. With reference to Hugh Trevor Roper's invention of tradition argument, Stuart's biographer and others have pointed out that some of the chiefs that Stuart wrote to confessed to having no knowledge of any such thing as a clan tartan or district tartan. But it strikes me that others did. And to me, this speaks to the nub of the argument that we intend to present in the exhibition. At this period, ideas about Highland tradition were being defined and codified by enthusiasts such as David Stewart, and in this case, seized on by commercial producers of tartan cloth like Wilson of Bannockburn as an attractive marketing device, but they did not come from nowhere. Stuart's interest in standardisation and classification comes out in his book Sketches of the Highlanders, which began life as a history of the Black Watch, but emerged as a collection of histories of the Highland regiments, and of the Highland clans, and of specific Highland traditions, such as bagpiping. It's not to take the part of the invention of tradition argument to say that Stewart, the soldier, organised his view of the past in a disciplined, regimented fashion, imposing order unto the chaos of human culture, as he did at Maida, I suppose. But the codification was easy to understand and identify with, and that's why I would suggest that it has stuck. He was first to produce the stock and trade of the tourist souvenir shop, the clan map, marking out supposed clan territories of Scotland, which is an appendix to the book. Again, not a falsehood, but drawing straight lines between and around something as amorphous and contingent as clan and family loyalty and influence was arguably a little audacious. The debate about the authenticity of Highland traditions was going on in Stuart's lifetime. The Highland Society of London, with its promotion of Gaelic literature, was much exercised by the ongoing controversy surrounding James Macpherson's Ossian poetry. Again, undoubtedly heavily embellished and reworked from original sources, but I would argue, taking the words of proper Gaelic scholars, which I certainly wouldn't suggest that I am, not entirely bogus. But it's the fraud that tends to be remembered. And there was, as is well known, much questioning and lampooning of the tartan element of the George IV visit, which was in part the product of the collaboration between Stewart and Sir Walter Scott. The origins of Stuart's friendship with Scott are not entirely clear, but the two were corresponding as early as 1811, and Scott took a keen interest in Stuart's 5 years of research into what became his sketches of the Highlanders. The Celtic or Celtic Society of Edinburgh, later the Royal Celtic Society, which operates today, was formed in 1820 by David Stewart and William Mackenzie of Grinyard, with Sir Walter Scott as president, and with objectives similar to the other Highland societies, which included encouraging and reviving the wearing of Highland dress in the Highlands. There were Highlanders through the society membership, but many were the professional men of the city, vulnerable to the suggestion that they were not the real deal, what we might call today affinity Highlanders. Stewart, nevertheless, was not, as we've heard, and with his military experience, he regimented and drilled the Celtic Society for their several ceremonial appearances as a body during the visit of George IV. And throughout, he wore that sword, presented to him by his fellow officers for his gallantry at Maida. Unlike some Highland chiefs in attendance, Stewart did not have to go shopping to equip himself for the visit. The most pointed criticism of the society came from within the world of the Highland societies. You may recognise this fantastic Henry Raeburn portrait from the Scottish National Gallery. Assertive of his ancestry and particular about his status, the mercurial and eccentric Alistair MacDonald of Glengarry had become exasperated with affinity Highlanders and formed his own Society of True Highlanders in 1815, from which those not born and bred and of the proper lineage were excluded. Of the prominence of the Celtic Society of Edinburgh in the 1822 celebrations, he wrote to the press, "I never saw so much tartan before in my life with so little Highland material. Their general appearance is assumed and fictitious, and they have no right to burlesque the national character or dress of the Highlands." Now, I like MacDonald as well, but it seems a bit of a cheat that this man dressed like that is having a go at the Edinburgh Society. Scott and Stewart were sensitive on the point themselves, as in Scott's invitation to the Chief of MacLeod to Edinburgh for the 1822 visit. "Do come and bring half a dozen or half a score of clansmen, so as to look like an island chief as you are. Highlanders are what he will most like to see, and the masquerade of the Celtic Society will not do without some of the real stuff to bear it out." So they knew. Glengarry, meanwhile, was a thorn in the side of Scott and Stewart throughout the royal visit, and his relationship with Stewart, who had been a member of the Society of True Highlanders, was probably strained further by Stewart's public criticism of Highland landowners for failing to stop or for actively encouraging the clearing of their tenants from their lands. And this is Stewart writing to a letter to the chief of the MacGregors in 1820. "Glengarry farms contained 1,500 souls, These farms now have 35 persons. Is this not extirpation? That's quite a strong word. So on these grounds, and also for his expressions of sympathy for the Jacobite cause, Stuart's sketches of the Highlanders was controversial. Patriarch and romantic as he was, David Stewart does not fit the stereotype of the Highland landlord worrying about the preservation of the kilt whilst blithely contributing to the destruction of traditional Highland society in the wholesale clearing of his estates. That's the stereotype. That's not what I think necessarily. So if you look at the sketches of the Highlanders book, the most interesting part, it seems to me, for us now is titled The Present State and Changes of the Character, Manners and Personal Appearance, which has chapters on the influence of political and economic arrangements, change in the character of the clans, introduction of fanaticism in religion, causes and consequences of these changes, state when placed on small lots of land, poverty followed by demoralisation, and then in contrast, beneficial results of judicious arrangements and of allowing time to acquire a knowledge of agricultural improvements, emigration, which Stuart had mixed views about, agricultural pursuits promoting independence and preventing pauperism. His published manuscript was in fact his published book was in fact watered down from his original manuscript on the advice of his friends as being too politically hot. Meanwhile, his sympathetic representation not only of the Jacobite cause, but of its Highland soldiers was criticised in the press, and in a published riposte, which came out in 1823, remarks on Colonel Stuart's sketches of the Highlanders, chiefly respecting the Jacobitism of the Highlanders, which was in essence a Whig attack on what had been identified, on what they identified as a Tory version of Highland history. And Peter and I were talking about this earlier. It's important to realise that just as today all these things about culture were working against a backdrop of contemporary politics. So there's a Whig-Tory thing going on here, and I would suggest to you that in this particular subject it still does. In any event, history and public sentiment was on Stuart's side. The expression of Jacobite sympathies was already beyond respectable and highly fashionable. And I want to conclude with a further example of Stuart's antiquarian activities from the collection of National Museum Scotland. The Culloden colours, one from each side of the 1746 battle, well-known exhibits in the National Museum, but what is less well known is that David Stewart played a part in their preservation. So colours, flags flown by infantry regiments in battle as sort of practical markers and rallying points, instilled with almost mystical significance as symbols of the honour of the regiment. Because if discipline has gone and the colour is taken, then that's disgrace. To take another regiment's colour is symbolic of victory. This is the colour of the Appin Stewart regiment, a large saltire St Andrew's cross. One of only two Jacobite colours from the Battle of Culloden to have survived, many of the rest having been taken and burnt by the public hangman in Edinburgh. The flag was with the Appin Stewart regiment as they broke into the Hanoverian left wing, and in the midst of retreat and defeat afterwards was spirited away from the battlefield by a retainer of Stewart of Ballachulish, actually a soldier named Donald Livingston, and there's the whole story about how he hid the colour at his home in Morven before taking it to his clan superior James Stewart. And the flag remained in the family for a further 180 years. The Jacobite colours displayed in the museum today, together with one of a pair of colours of Barrow's Regiment of Foot of the Hanoverian Army, of the British Army, because it was the British Army, which that day stood on the left, facing roughly the Appin Stewarts. Those are these. The survival of these British Army Culloden colours and the fact that they're together we owe in large part to Stuart. He acquired Barrow's regiment's colours from a later colonel of that regiment. The way the system worked at that time, the colours of a regiment were actually the property of the colonel. And he acquired them recognising their historic significance. he didn't have to deal with textile conservation issues. What did he do with them? What did he do with these symbols of Hanoverian victory, of the victory of a British army which Stuart had spent his life serving? In 1824, he gave them to James Stewart of Ballachulish, so that, in Garth's words, the flags which were opposed to each other at Culloden might thereafter rest in peace side by side. And it was with that sentiment that the opposing Culloden colours passed down to the Stewart Society first of all, then to what's now the National War Museum in Edinburgh Castle, and into the National Collection so that they can be seen together today. And it seems to me far-sighted and quite poignant that someone only 2 generations away from Culloden and all that that meant, and with a foot in either camp, as it were, could see and seek that sense of reconciliation, mindful of the dignity of the defeated. Needful of funds to maintain the Garth and Chumchari estates, Stuart remained in military service, looking for a position. If you read the correspondence of military officers at this period, it's what it's all about, looking for positions. At the time of his death, he had obtained an appointment as Governor of St. Lucia in the West Indies. He was formerly a Colonel of the Royal West India Rangers. Almost his last work prior to his death in 1829 was preparation of a report for the government recommending measures to improve the conditions of enslaved people working on the island's plantations. If this in itself was no denouncement of the slavery plantation system, it was at least a humane response to the abuses and neglect he saw as he toured the island. Stuart had seen plenty of slavery in earlier military postings to the West Indies, and in Sketches of the Highlanders he refers to the slave trade outlawed in Britain in 1807 as an atrocious and inhuman traffic. It seems to me that his position on this is an interesting reflection of the overall relationship between Britain and indeed Scotland and Atlantic slavery, which is a hot topic at the moment. Since, like so many other Scottish gentry families, Stuart had investments in colonial plantations, whatever he may have thought about the human and moral aspects of what he himself could see. He was a man of his times, but I would argue a progressive one. He died in service in the West Indies. This is a portrait which is coming to the exhibition, which has turned up. So I'm quite chuffed about that. And there are print reproductions of it, but we seem to have found the original. Stuart's name might have fallen from public notice somewhat, but he was considered in his day and after his death to be a serious figure in the history and historiography of Scotland, meriting an entry in the 1835 Biographical Dictionary of Eminent Scotsmen. And as we've heard, in an 1826 letter to J.G. Lockhart, Sir Walter Scott described his friend as honest Garth, a Highlander of the old stamp. The inscription on the statue placed at Keltneyburn commemorates him as a true Highlander. I have not done him justice here, but I hope at least I have given you some sense of why that was. Stuart might indeed have sought to codify and construct elements of the traditions of the Scottish Highlands to suit contemporary tastes and advance the interests of that part of the country, with consequences that remain with us today in relation to what defines Scotland still in the global imagination. But he was the real thing, and that in essence will be one of the messages of the exhibition that I hope you'll come and see. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Stuart. That was amazing. In the way, it's a parallel life with Scots. I mean, 1772, I think you said, so he was a year younger than Scots inside. And all the way you were going through that, I could see points where his life touched with Scots. Alexandria, Maida. The dog, Maida, came from the Glengarry chap, by the way.
That's right. Yeah.
And the 1822 celebrations. And Scott would have loved those two opposing flags being brought together. He would have loved a gesture like that. And of course, when I read this poem out in 1828, they were both nearing the end of their lives and probably knew it as well. Going to the West Indies was highly dangerous and Scott had had a stroke by that point, so they were saying farewell, effectively. But there were a lot of interesting points there, and I'm sure people will want to ask some questions. Well, I'm fairly sure. Gentlemen there.
I just wondered if, thank you, that was absolutely fascinating. I'm looking forward immensely to the exhibition, I'm sure we all are. But is there anything that we can say about the influence that Garth might have had on Scots' views about that issue about the clearances? I'm thinking of the quote about extirpation, which, if I'm right, was Garth talking about MacDonald.
Yeah.
Still, he obviously had, it sounds from that he had a fairly defined view on what we might call the clearances debate at that time, and so did Scott actually by that time. But then they must have been very closely working together in 1822, and one just wonders.
I would think that Scott would have deferred to Stewart in his. I think that Scott would have probably deferred to Stewart in his views. I haven't read all the correspondence between them, but this thing about Stewart being real, I think Scott kind of understood. I think Scott may have been one of those whose counsel was to tone it down a bit.
So in that sense, it maybe did influence him.
Yeah.
Interesting about Maida, it was mentioned that the gift of the wolfhound was in fact from
That's right.
MacDonald and Gary,
yeah,
as you mentioned. What was the connection with the battle in which Stewart of Garth was badly wounded?
I had thought for a long time that, and I'm afraid if you go to the National War Museum, I think you might see written on a label that the dog was a gift to Walter Scott from David Stewart. So that's what's called a mistake by me. I think it was, as far as I'm aware, it was just a sense that victory was being celebrated. And was kind of known at the time.
Yeah, I have a trace memory that one of the MacDonald family was at.
Right, you may be right, sir. Yeah,
that was somehow a connection.
Yeah.
So one other point, if I may, I think that the origin of the sketches, the very beginning of the concept of the sketches, came from the colonel of the Black Watch, whose regimental records had been lost.
That's right.
And he asked David Stewart if you would fill in the gap. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, and the project just grew and grew. Yeah. So he was in fact commissioned to write a history, and that way of writing regimental history,
Yeah.
and of relating the day-to-day history, if you like, of the Highland regiments to an inheritance from clan society.
Yeah.
Is the thing that he sort of brought to the table. Yeah.
Is it the Celtic Society or Celtic? Celtic, that you say, do you, or Celtic?
I say Celtic, but
let's say Celtic then. Does that society, the Scottish one, of which he was a big wig in, and Scott was the president of, does that still survive?
Yeah, the Royal Celtic Society. I'm sure there must be members of the Royal Celtic Society or members of this club.
Because we each year in our annual dinner we have a representative from a club or society that Scott is associated with to give an address. So this should be on the card, shouldn't it, for ourselves?
And if you go to Abbotsford, you'll see there are two swords of Walter Scott's. One is the sword that is supposed, and he believes, to have been the property of the Marquis of Montrose, the great Marquis. And then there's the second one, which is this great ornate basket-hilded affair, was presented to Scott by the Celtic Society. It's a couple of years after the 1822 visit, but yeah, that's quite something.
Talking about exhibits, my father used to, when he visited Abbotsford from down south, he loved an exhibit was a Highlander's pouch, which there were remnants of oats in. It's under a glass, it always was under a glass case at Abbotsford. And it touched my father about, a soldier going to battle with just some oats in a little pouch.
I'm trying to think if that's still there.
I've often wondered if someone gave it to Scott, but I wondered if it would have been genuine.
I mean, I would expect so. I mean, we have the immediate thing, the equivalent that's in the national collection is the sporran with the pistols in it. So there are pistols in the locking mechanism of the sporran. So if you don't open it in the same way, the little pistols fire. And if that's a kind of thing of fancy, and it appears in Rob Roy. So Scots, and so it is not the other way around. It's not that someone made this thing because it's back to this thing that Scott is always accused of fancy, but he was interested in authenticity, not in collecting, from the point of view collecting ballads and all sorts of literary things and collecting artifacts. So some of the things that Daniel Terry foisted on Walter Scott probably weren't the real thing. The sporrans, I'm sure they are. Yeah.
Any other?
Did he always wear spectacles? It must have been quite a drawback for a commander of an army regiment in those days.
There's a portrait miniature of him as a young officer in the 1790s, and he's not wearing them. All the later portraits are post 1822, so hard to say.
They must have been quite essential for them, otherwise he would have put them aside for the portraits, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, it could be one or the other. Yeah, but they're thick, so I think you might be right. Yeah, one sees. Yes, I mean one sees. I was talking about Ralph Abercrombie. His spectacles survive. We have his spectacles. A lot of military officers were short-sighted, but they don't wear them in their portraits. So yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Well, before we draw to close, and thanks Stuart one final time, I'd just like to mention the details of our next meeting. In fact, I'll move over there so I'm audible at the back if I may. The next meeting will be our annual joint lecture with the Edinburgh University English Department. This year's talk being given by David Bruce on the subject of what Sir Walter did for Hollywood. It's at 5:15 on Thursday the 4th of October in the Advocates Library. Admission is free, though tickets, which are still available from Lee, are needed for entry. So hope to see you there next. And finally, I'd like to call on Lieutenant Commander Durban Gunn, OBE, to give our vote of thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I was asked fairly late on today to do this. He said, Peter said, you're a Highlander and you've had some experience with the military, in fact, 22 years in the Navy, if you consider that the military. But also I have a connection with Dr. Allan here. Both of us served one way or another in the castle. Well, you in a very distinguished way, mine less so, but we're both members of the officers' mess in the castle. This was towards the end of the Cold War, and I was recruited as a sort of naval liaison officer voluntarily for the Lowland Brigade. So our paths crossed, and may I say as a compliment, sir, that you haven't changed in appearance since those very happy days in the castle. Well, Dr. Allan has given us a wonderful sweep through a very interesting part of Scottish history, particularly for me as a Highlander, because he's gone from Culloden and the defeat of the Jacobite cause, the prohibition of wearing tartan, the irony of the British regiments wearing tartan and resuscitating the wearing of tartan, and central to all this was a man who is not a distinguished soldier, at the same time a man of literary talent in the shape of General Stewart. I think the Highlandization of Scotland is a particularly interesting subject and so well covered right throughout and reaching perhaps its zenith at the time of 1822 when we had Walter Scott engineering the visitor of George IV. But I think it's this wonderful mixture of a man of action, a man who could write his sketches, a man who felt deeply about the situation in the Highlands, post-colonial situation, in a way that many landlords didn't. And I think Dr. Allan has made it also easy to understand, to pick up. And in fact, what he has done is made it quite clear that we must not in any way miss this exhibition. And as a sort of, not a PR man for you, but I will say that I'm personally dying to go to see this exhibition. So thank you very much, sir, for giving us a very entertaining and very thoughtful and deep talk this evening. So I'd ask you all to show your appreciation in the normal way. Thank you.